On January 13, 1880, the Baltimore Sun presented its readers a sobering epitaph when it reported the death of George Peck, a black man brutally murdered in Poolesville, Maryland, at the hands of a mob two nights before. Of Peck's lynching, the papers spoke stoically and without formality or flourish, stating, "At Bellsville, Montgomery County, last Saturday morning, George W. Peck, colored, attempted an outrage on the person of a little white girl, 11 years of age, but the screams of the child brought relief before the wretch had accomplished his purpose." Peck was arrested and taken to Poolesville, Maryland, where, in the evening, he was forcibly taken from an officer and hanged. A jury of inquest rendered a verdict that Peck, quote, came to his death from strangulation by the hands of parties unknown to the jurors. Peck admitted the attempted outrage. For Peck, this came as a curious coda to a violent 12-hour event that gripped the Washington region and made headlines across the nation. The first recorded lynching to occur in Montgomery County, Maryland, Peck's death released a specter of violence that would continue to haunt the region for decades to come. Today's presentation, by the hands of parties unknown, will focus on Montgomery County's 3 known lynching cases and seeks to explore the causes and effects of racial terror lynchings and their continuing legacies. To this, I will also mention current efforts to commemorate these historical events through a burgeoning remembrance and reconciliation movement here in Maryland and nationwide. George Peck. Birth, date and place unknown. Age approximately 22 years. Death, January 10th, 1880. On the rural farm of Lemuel Bell in the western part of this county, on January 10, 1880, a cry for help cracked the morning air of the quiet rural hamlet of Bellsville. The girl, Ada Hayes, aged 11 or 15, depending on which newspaper accounts one might have read, was accosted by a farmhand, 22-year-old or thereabouts, while attempting to conduct her usual chores. Her assailant, George Peck, had grabbed Ada from behind, according to printed accounts, and carried her to a straw rick nearby. Inside of the grassy mound, he had burrowed out a small compartment in which to stash Ada, where he planned to commit one or more treacherous acts, as the local papers would later insist. But whatever was intended to befall young Ada would not be carried out that day, as her shrieks grabbed the notice of a neighbor, Calvin Amy, a local minister who resided across the street from Bell's farm. Racing to the scene, Reverend Amy found Ada in Peck's grip. Drawing a pistol, Amy considered shooting down Peck, but now he had let the girl go, and by one account had returned to his chores as if nothing unusual had happened. Reverend Amy ran to a nearby store where he found Bell, and within minutes had sounded the alarm and the village mobilized. And we have the 1879 Hopkins map here, and it shows the farm of Lemuel Bell, the farm of the Griffiths, where it's believed that Peck was living and working as a field hand, and other sites that I'm mentioning. At 10 a.m., Deputy Sheriff Miles arrived from Poolesville with reinforcements. Peck, seeing that he was about to be arrested, allegedly ran, or attempted to run, to the safety of a piney forest nearby, where conflicting accounts claimed that he either hid out for several hours or was overtaken by his captors without struggle. Peck was taken to Bell's store, tied up, interrogated, and ultimately confessed to his, quote, fiendish acts, end quote, as one of the conflicting reports claimed. Reverend Amy and Ada Hayes were brought in to view the prisoner before carrying him off to nearby Poolesville for safekeeping. But the word was out, and from this point on, Peck was a man whose fate had been marked. At 5 p.m., Sheriff Miles arrived with the prisoner in Poolesville, which served as the seat of law enforcement for that part of the county. Some 10 miles from the county seat, Sheriff Miles deemed Poolesville the safer place to jail him rather than risk taking him and him being abducted by a mob en route to the county jail in Rockville, who might seek to administer vigilante justice of their own. What led Miles to choose the Oddfellows Hall as the safest place to lodge Mr. Peck is unknown, but there he secured his prisoner while contemplating his next move. Meanwhile, the news of Peck's alleged outrage had served to wake up the sleepy countryside, and while it's not known where exactly the disgruntled citizenry rose up from, they nonetheless began to trickle into town. By nightfall, the crowd was a full-fledged mob, swelling in numbers from 35 to 100 men, according to competing estimates, and demanding of the sheriff the opportunity of examining Mr. Peck for themselves. But the sheriff, ever wary, refused entrance to the hall. As the clock struck 11 p.m., the crowd dispersed. At this point, perhaps, Sheriff Miles felt confident that he could move Peck to a more secure location. He deemed his own home just a few miles from town to be fitting in the event that the mob should return and try to storm the hall. Perhaps it was naivete, or perhaps it was indeed Sheriff Miles' first rodeo, but Poolesville, while small in population and stature, was anything but a one-horse town. Believing the coast was clear, Miles exited the hall with the prisoner in tow, making a straight line for the store of William Walter, directly across the street. There, he had hoped to pick up some provisions, but no sooner had he entered the store and locked the door behind him than the mob reappeared, some donning masks and blackface, firing shots into the cold night air. Forcing their way into the store, the mob quickly grabbed a hold of George Peck, while blindfolding and detaining the sheriff on sight, intent on whisking Peck to his final resting place. But as they placed a rope around Peck's neck and proceeded to drag him from the store, one or more of the assailants kicked over a hot wood stove and nearly set the store ablaze. Now the mob, with prize in hand, made a dash for the grisly finish line, setting their sights on a field across from the Presbyterian Church, where a large locust tree awaited from which to hang their bedraggled prey. Hauling him down the street and tossing his body over a fence without ceremony, Peck, perhaps, now resolved to meet his maker, if such a God could possibly exist. The locust tree, selected for the job, greeted Peck with an outstretched limb, ready to receive its tawny victim as if flexing a muscle to the sky. With a mighty hoist from the mob and its rope, Peck was swept up some 5 feet or so from the ground, and there he remained without judge or justice as his body swung lifelessly until the following morning. In the matter of minutes, the deed had been done, and the short life of George Peck, not unlike the lynching itself, then began its long sojourn into obscurity until now. So I've included between narratives just a few sites now and then that relate to the events I'm describing. You see Bell's Crossroads, which used to be an actual village. I called it a hamlet. It's really more of a crossroads and probably really an afterthought. No one lives there. A few people probably would have the mailing address, but I think it's officially Dickerson once you're up there. The house below the picture of the intersection is the William Griffith House. That is the farm on which George Peck lived, at least as of the 1870 census. He does not appear on the 1880 census. Poolesville Presbyterian Church, built in 1844, same artifice still stands today, right across from the lynching site. And next to it, or across the street, a parking lot, which may have been the place where Peck was murdered. John Dorsey, alias Diggs, birth, date and place unknown, age approximately 22 years, death July 26, 1880, Rockville, Maryland. Like George Peck, John Diggs, as the newspapers identified him, was around 22 years of age, single, and residing with a white couple, Thomas and Lily Shefali. On the census, Mrs. Shefali is identified by Mary, so I will identify her as such in this. He was employed as a servant on their Darnestown, Maryland farm and appears on the 1880 census as John Dorsey. How he came to live with the Shefalis is not known at this time. Late in 1880, Thomas Shefali went away on business, leaving Mary and John in the household alone, when, according to accounts, John became violent and attacked Mary by beating her and detaining her against her will. The following day, John fled the farm, and Mary staggered to the safety of neighbors. A manhunt ensued, and John was quickly captured in another part of the county. Transported to jail in Rockville, he soon found himself the focus of a mob, which wasted no time in descending upon the jail in the middle of the night and demanding his release into their eager hands. The jail was stormed, and Dorsey was taken by force. According to news accounts, Mr. Dorsey confessed to the assault on Miss Shefali, but denied beating and terrorizing her, providing an inkling of doubt as to what had transpired between them. The West Farm, along present-day Route 28 near Watts Branch, was the likely location that was chosen as the place to hang Dorsey, which happened upon the arrival of James Shefali 2 hours before dawn. Dorsey's death did not put an end to his suffering, however, as accounts of the incident were reprinted in papers nationwide. Dorsey and other lynching victims sustained ongoing character assassination by the press and served as proxies in a social calamity that stood on the verge of subsuming the nation. And this is the 1880 census, and it shows the Shefalis along with Dorsey. He appears to be in a separate household, but most likely on their property. Two interesting sites that figure into the story of Mr. Dorsey is the county jail. This jail was in Rockville for well over 100 years. It's where people were incarcerated. There was a yard in the back where hangings occurred, at least in the 20th century, maybe earlier. And this is the jail from which Mr. Dorsey was abducted to go to his lynching. Below it is an image of the county council building, which stands on the same site. And it's interesting to note that the county council passed legislation to form the Remembrance and Reconciliation Commission, which Jim Stowe spoke about. So maybe in the future, a monument or a plaque can chronicle the stories there. After his death, he was transported to the poorhouse or the Almshouse as it was known, which was out 7 Locks Road. It's the site of the county's correctional facility. According to historian Linda Dyer, who wrote a book about lynchings and mob violence on the Eastern Shore, poorhouses were not only places where lynching victims were taken to be buried, usually in paupers' graves, but sometimes lynch mobs would actually carry the live person to the poorhouse and lynch them there, so the body wouldn't have to be moved another time. Okay. And this is an article that was recently discovered by one of our researchers, Paul Holmes, and it is appears to be an ad for Diggs. Novel obituary notice. It mentions Diggs, his death in Rockville at sunrise in the 24th year of his age. John, eldest son of Pompey and Chloe Diggs, of strangulation after a brief suspension. Funeral after inquest. With a little digging along with Sarah Heglin with the Jane Sween Library, she discovered Pompey and Chloe being the stereotypical names of the time, and the butt of printed jokes and papers all throughout the period. So this was someone's idea of a funny, lighthearted way to describe a lynching from a paper in Tennessee. Sidney Randolph, date and place of birth unknown, possibly Georgia or Louisiana. Age unknown. Date of death, July 4th, 1896, Rockville, Maryland. Our final account, that of Sidney Randolph, raises more questions than answers. Randolph, a loner with no local ties and likely an itinerant laborer from Georgia or Louisiana, arrived in the county and stumbled into an unfolding drama that might have been called the crime of the century. The story of the Buxton family of Gaithersburg is simply too voluminous to give proper treatment in such a short presentation. But suffice it to say, it was the most unusual of the accounts that ended in a lynching. On the morning of May 25th, while the Buxtons were sleeping, an intruder broke into their home and attempted to bludgeon the slumbering members before they could awake and fight back. Husband and wife, Richard and Teeny Buxton, along with daughters Maud, Sadie, and their infant son Carol, fended off blows from an axe-wielding figure. Little Carol was the only one who escaped unharmed. Transported to D.C.'s Garfield Hospital, the family was treated for their injuries. All survived except for Sadie, who died of wounds to the head. Suspicion first fell upon a black man named George Neal, who had allegedly had bad blood with Mr. Buxton and had served time for an assault. But mysteriously cleared, the folks shifted from Neal to Randolph, who had no seeming ties to the Buxtons whatsoever. Despite a lack of eyewitnesses and evidence, the Buxtons went from being unable to identify their assailant to eventually settling on the fact that it was indeed Randolph. Ultimately arrested and moved to safety in Baltimore, it looked as if a lynching was unlikely. The Buxtons' case was a titillating affair, coming 4 years on the heels of the famous Lizzie Borden murders. The Washington area finally had their own celebrity whodunit, and it seemed like a showcase trial was fixing to unfold. But Randolph was brought back to Rockville and placed in jail in June, and soon after, the old rumblings of lynch him began reverberating in town. A trial scheduled for November was for naught, as on the evening of July 4th, Independence Day, a mob appeared at the jail demanding Randolph and carried him into the night. The following morning, fresh tracks revealed the path that the morbid party had taken their wagon through the town's west end, and arriving at a chestnut tree within feet of a public road, most likely the road to Frederick, in the vicinity of present-day Montgomery College, Rockville. Randolph's innocence had been held by many people in the county who believed the paltry evidence against him simply didn't add up. Once the word got out of Randolph's death, one paper reported the anger of the black community and exposed a plan by black residents of Sandy Spring to take up arms and travel to Gaithersburg with the intent of lynching Mr. Buxton. White residents of Gaithersburg closed ranks, but the black mob never materialized. An apocryphal account due to mass hysteria? The facts of this we may never know. One of the interesting things about Sidney Randolph, he's one of the few lynching victims of the 19th century that we actually have an image of. And in fact, we have two images of him, we assume taken from life by reporters of the time. Most of the images, the Buxtons as well as Randolph, appeared in Washington's Evening Star newspaper. To the left is Maud, to the right, Sadie, often referred to as Little Sadie Buxton. And below are the two images, artist renderings of the crime scene. This was the kind of stuff that was in the papers during the Lizzie Borden murder trial. And an interesting side note, the Buxtons finally recovered, moved back to their home sometime in the fall of that year, and installed what the papers described as a security system with a burglar alarm. And scratch my head, an 1896 burglar alarm, what is that? But they described it as a device when attached to a window. Upon opening the window, an alarm would be set off. No doubt that the Buxtons suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and probably other ailments for years, but also curious that having been so assured that they got the right person, that they would still feel that they would need security on their home. And one final note about the Randolph case. After his death, Pumphrey Funeral Home handled his burial arrangements. I think the county government paid for a pine box. And this is the establishment that he would have been prepared at. After putting him in the coffin, the funeral home left it open for several days, so local citizens could come by and view the body, which is pretty interesting. All right. Historical patterns. Peck, Diggs, and Randolph were each the subject of conflicting accounts in local and national media. Which conducted little investigation into the alleged crime and seldom printed statements from the accused, unless it was a confession of crime. Rape of a white woman was almost always implied, if not outright stated. Epithets used to denigrate the accused character, were also employed. Papers tended to fire up locals, often provoking further lynchings. Most of the evidence mentioned in these papers were of undocumented or questionable origin. Most of the lynching victims, not only in Montgomery County, but across Maryland and all throughout the South, tended to be loners with no known family members or strong community ties. Ages were unknown for the deceased. Many were described as brutes and reviled for their powerful physical prowess. They were alleged to have committed crimes previously. In all three of our cases, that accusation was leveled, but to date, researchers have not been able to find any records of previous crimes. And they were alleged to have had sexually assaulted or outraged or accosted white women or girls. Among whites in these cases, there are also similarities. The victim is almost always white womanhood. The victim is assumed guilty of the crime before judgment by white audiences. Lynch mobs, locally and nationally, formed quickly and had a plan. The call on law enforcement to turn over the prisoner, then overpower the law enforcement officer when their request was denied, was part and parcel of almost every story. White assailants viewed their actions as justified, both before God and the law. White assailants were obsessed with getting the victim to confess to the crime prior to killing them. They sought to justify their actions post-lynching by bringing forth new evidence, sometimes up to a year after the victim's death. And juries of inquest were seated and ruled the victim was killed by hands of parties unknown, verdicts which often came about within minutes and seldom within hours. Law enforcement also showed interesting patterns. They were noble in their job to uphold the law. They always sought to move the victim to a safe location if violence was threatened. They returned the victim accused once threats had abated, but informed the public of this nonetheless. They fought valiantly to keep the mob from seizing the prisoner in almost every case. This is described. They are usually incapacitated in some way, overpowered, blindfolded, bound, but rarely injured by the mob. And they always were indignant and demanded investigations into the identity of the mob members, and they seldom got results. Many of these scenarios played out not only locally but nationally. Attitudes and influences of the three local lynchings reflected trends nationwide that dovetailed nicely with the end of Reconstruction in 1877 and the institutionalization of Jim Crow in 1896. Between 1877 and 1950, more than 4,000 documented lynchings took place in America, with most of those being African Americans in the southern states, though Mexicans, Italians, and Jewish people were occasionally among the targets. In Maryland, according to the Equal Justice Initiative of Alabama, nearly 30 lynchings were recorded during this period, though current local scholarship in Maryland has revealed at least 44 lynchings have occurred in the state, with the last one being that of George Armwood in Princess Anne, Maryland, in October of 1933. With no protections from the federal government, which African Americans enjoyed after the Civil War, white supremacy quickly subsumed the political structure. Whites meted out justice as local mores saw fit. In Montgomery County, the 3 documented lynchings were sparked by the gravest of accusations of sexual assault or the murder of a white person. Yet in the Deep South, acts as simple as walking on a sidewalk instead of walking in the street, failing to address a white person in a particular way, or being disrespectful, argumentative, or insolent were among the litanies of crime that resulted in African Americans being murdered by lynching. Not uncommon to these crimes was a sense of spectacle and the employment of ritual practices. Victims met their death by hanging, beating, gunshot, and burning at the stake on occasion. Lynch parties were known to extract souvenirs from their victims' corpses, such as earlobes, teeth, gold fillings, fingers, testicles, amongst articles of clothing and personal effects. Not infrequently, such trophies were put on display for the general public, recalling the Byzantine practices of old Europe, with heads on spikes lining public roads and bodies drawn and quartered, featuring prominent in village squares. According to one account, after the lynching of George Peck, members of the mob unloaded shotgun blast into his body to assure he was dead. Other reports said this happened, but that they missed their target. Who knows? Following the murder of Sidney Randolph, his body was prepared for burial by Pumphrey's funeral home, but not before it was displayed for several days in an open casket so the public can gawk. And I believe in the Dorsey case, the mob, after killing him, took the rope, cut it into pieces, and handed out the pieces as souvenirs. I'm going to move off my script for just a couple of minutes and run quickly through the rest of the presentation, then take questions. Justice, after the period of lynching, came slowly in the 20th century. Rockville has a story to tell, but I suspect that we don't even know even a fraction of it. Landmark events on the road to desegregation and equality include the 1936 Gibbs versus Board of Education case, where a young Thurgood Marshall came and argued for equal pay for black and white teachers in this building, the gray brick courthouse, which still stands today. He won that case, and it was considered one of the stepping stones to Brown versus Board. Fast forward to the 1960s, thank you, to the 1960s, specifically 1960, the desegregation of Glen Echo Park, which protests lasted for months. Here we see members of a concerned citizens group. Many of the members actually aligned with George Lincoln Rockwell's American Nazi Party, whose headquarters was in Arlington, Virginia, and made at least 2 trips to Montgomery County. And you can read the signs, more akin to the 19th century than to 1960s Montgomery County. One famous case, the Giles Johnson rape case, two brothers and a friend from near the Sandy Spring area tried and convicted on questionable evidence of raping a white woman. At the time, it was a capital offense, and they were given the death penalty. Referred to as Maryland's Scottsboro case, they were eventually exonerated a few years later. And while the period of lynching is long behind us, it casts long shadows and often leaves doubt. In 1986, a young man from Silver Spring, Keith Warren, was found dead in a stand of woods hanging from a tree by a rope. The police investigated, deemed it to be a suicide, but things about like his hands being bound, how could he commit suicide and hang himself from a tree if his hands were bound, things and so forth, prompted his mother to fight for years until her death to have the case reopened. A few months ago, I spoke about this and used this slide publicly, and was informed that I shouldn't use the slide because the policeman investigating the case, who had ruled it to be a suicide, was publicly ridiculed, and threats were leveled against him. But I have to believe that in a presentation on lynching, that even though we don't know whether it was a suicide or not, that it's important that we chronicle, record, and remember those incidents that still affect and send reverberations of fear and uncertainty throughout our community. So, where does this leave us? What secrets remain to be revealed? This is an artifact. It is the rope that was used to hang Guy Vernon Thompson. I believe it was the last hanging in the county. I might be wrong. But this was preserved and is among the artifacts at the Montgomery County Historical Society. While we move away from the more grisly forms of justice and retribution, we as human beings, I think, still remain fascinated with this period of time, and want to move on quickly. Today, we're digging for information. This image shows a number of African American communities that form satellite communities around Poolesville. No one there today that any of us have spoken to have a memory of the lynchings, anything that was passed down through their family. Though the Poolesville lynching happened within half a city block of a black school. The Randolph lynching most likely took place within sight of both Lincoln Park and Rockville's Hayti community. So the effects must have been profound. The house pictured here, which is the Jones Sims house from Jonesville, is actually called Freedom House, and it's at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, if you want to see it there. And just a few more slides. The work of remembrance and reconciliation is being fueled by the Equal Justice Initiative. Brian Stevens' groundbreaking work out of Alabama. Many of you may now know his name because of the film Just Mercy. If you get a chance, please see it. It's very good. A number of years ago, they opened a museum which features the names of as many lynching victims across the nation that they could research and document. It also features this art installation, these tablets, if you will, that have the names hanging in suspension. Soil collections, marker program, and a garden which features tablets from each state where there was a lynching in each county. Local jurisdictions can actually apply to claim their tablet and bring it here. There is not one for Montgomery County, but it's being fabricated, and we are hoping through the work of Jim Stowe and the commission to claim our tablet and bring it here. And finally, on November 3rd, 2019, we held a soil collection for George Peck in Poolesville. And this upcoming year, the Montgomery County Lynching Memorial Project, which I'm a member of, will do 2 more soil collections, one for John Dorsey, and I'm being told to stop, and one for Sidney Randolph. In the back, you'll see our good friend Ruth Gaynor. She's sitting at a table. She's got all of our propaganda. So if you want to get involved or write a fat check so we can fund this thing, that would be great. And now I will stop, and I will take any questions you may have. And if I don't blast your eardrums, there are microphones there. Just step up to the mic if you have any questions.
Near Sandy Spring, and I
Yes.
was interested in the location of the Buttons Farm. Is it at Woodlawn?
A Button Farm Living
Yeah.
History Center? I run a nonprofit called the Menare Foundation. Our chief project is the Button Farm. It's actually in Germantown, right up the road on Black Rock Road, inside of Seneca Creek State Park.
Okay, thank you. I was hoping it was closer.
Yep, and we opened in the spring. So.
Yeah.
Hi, I just had a quick question. Were any women ever lynched, or was it always men?
As far as I know, none in the state of Maryland that we have documented. In the case of George Armfield in Princess Anne, after they lynched Armfield, there was threats to lynch the female members of his family, and they moved them out of state. Throughout the South, yes, women were lynched, and usually when it happened, the high crime and misdemeanor was begging tearfully for the life of the male counterpart. So, 2 for 1. Women could be lynched for refusing sexual advances of their employers. That was a fun one. The list goes on. Usually men, but women were not excluded. Yes?
If you're more interested in these 3 lynchings, Jay Mallon did a presentation that you can see online. It's at stjohnsnorwood.org YouTube channel. And he did a presentation on these 3 lynchings with maps and clippings.
Thank you. Jay Mallon is a documentarian locally who does great work, and did a really nice 90-second piece on our lynching soil collection, George Peck soil collection. Yes.
Hi. I read about the Randolph lynchings when this was talked about at a previous conference in the old Evening Star, and was there an attempt to find out who really attacked the Buxtons and also who some of the lynch mob were in 1896?
the papers of the Times, the DC papers, some of the reporters were not convinced of Randolph's guilt, and may have been strongly convinced otherwise. But my sense of it is, and by the way, Randolph is the case I've studied the least, because there's so much paper involved in it, and it would be a great project for a group to pursue. But my sense is you can only really gather information in these cases when people want to talk and the community didn't want to talk. And chances are that the community was involved, and the chances are that the members of the lynching party may have been members of the jury of inquest. There were systems for locking this information down.
Thank you.
Yep. Hi.
Simple question, I think, but all three of the stories involved the victim having been in custody and then unlawfully removed from custody. So I'm just wondering, is that an inherent part of the definition of a lynching, or is that just a common element?
Yeah, it's a common element. Part of the definition of a lynching is it defines the act as an extrajudicial killing. In at least one of the cases, I'm recalling something about the lynch mob being very concerned about getting the confession before actually lynching their victim. Morality weighed heavily, lightly on some, but the deed was done. And I don't think this was in any of the Montgomery County cases, but somewhere, I believe it was a Maryland case, they had, they found the victim on a Sunday, seized them from a jail on a Sunday night, and it was it was just before midnight, and they held off the lynching till a few minutes after midnight so they wouldn't take his life on the Lord's Day. Anyone else? All right. Oh, Jim.
Tony, I think it would be remiss if we did not also share, and you can certainly get a number of accounts, particularly further down south, that lynchings were not just this mob-motivated kind of instant reaction. In many instances, it was an event for that particular community. It was sometimes an event for which persons would come after church with picnic baskets and so forth, and it was around that kind of environment that this also occurred.
Yep. Absolutely. Some of these events are described as spectacles or having a fair-like ambiance to them, and some of them lasted for hours. There's a very famous picture of a lynching. I believe it's from Omaha, Nebraska, 1921. I forget the gentleman's name. But after being tortured, I think publicly whipped with a bull whip, might have even been branded, he was set on fire. That lynching was viewed by a young Henry Fonda, I think at the age of 8 or 9. And Jane Fonda later said that changed the course of his life. So while these were indeed many times spectacles in big public events, part of that big crowdsourcing of violence was not only meant to strike terror in the communities of color, but most likely to strike terror among whites, to stay in their place, toe the line, and uphold white supremacy.
Hi, I have a question.
Sure.
I'm having a physical reaction to everything that you're saying, so this is very intense for me. But I wonder, what do you mean by restorative justice and community reconciliation?
Yes.
As part of the community, I would like to reach that, but I'm not sure I grasp the full concept.
Yeah, let me try for the shortest explanation I can. The concept of the Equal Justice Initiative, which backs a lot of the remembrance and reconciliation projects across the country, is first to remember. Memory isn't necessarily the thing that we hold in our brain, our file of facts, our rewind on our lives, things that we've experienced. But it also seizes upon the collective memory, the national narrative, how we got here. When you think of our origins with slavery, through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, peonage, the period of the kind of upheaval of white supremacy called the Nadir, civil rights movement. There's always been a struggle, and it's been predicated by events that have come before. And the belief is that until you acknowledge, or we as a nation acknowledge how we deal with one another, that we can never achieve that kumbaya moment, everybody just get along. And also that what was spawned by slavery changed forms over the past century and a half. And so slavery became peonage and forced labor, all the way to the pipeline to prison. So it's really looking at modern issues and modern ills and tracing their origins, to at least acknowledge where those came from. I will say that the Equal Justice Initiative uses the term remembrance and reconciliation. When that's mentioned, people often say truth and reconciliation. It would be great to have a debate about this, not today, but truth and reconciliation is one of those terms that came from apartheid South Africa and probably even before that. But that was people acknowledging in their lifetime their role in the system of apartheid and fighting the system of apartheid and all the crimes that and injustices that occurred. We don't have the lynch mobs, so it's remembrance and reconciliation, but it's really a move to seize upon the truth. I think that's probably it. Yep. Thank you all so much.